John, you arrived in Cyprus in the late 1950s. What motivated you to become a teacher and eventually set foot on Aphrodite's island?
I came out of university with not very much idea of what to do, really. And I did a bit of teaching in England, not very much, but it seemed to me quite a good life, and I quite enjoyed it. The 1950s in England was a pretty dreary place, you know. It was almost as if the war was still going on. When a job came up in Cyprus, although it was the so-called emergency, which I prefer to call the insurgency, we came out, and it was very interesting, I think. We came to Limassol, and there was no harbour. It was just a roadstead where ships anchored, and if you had a car on board, and lots of people did, they would see their cars hoisted up over the bare sea for a few agonising moments before being dropped into a lighter. I remember the drive to Nicosia, and it was, I remember being struck by two things. The very narrow strip of asphalt, which was then the main road, which meant that two cars could not pass on the asphalt. So it was a game of chicken as to who yielded first, you know. And then there were loads of women working on the roads, doing quite heavy manual work. I was taken to the office to meet the head of Turkish education, a man who spoke the most beautiful English. He told me that I was going to be sent off to Paphos to be head of the English department there. Paphos was then very remote. The point about Paphos is that it was very small. 6,000 people lived in Katima and practically nobody down at the port. It was 3/5 Greek Cypriot and 2/5 Turkish. We were, because my wife was also employed at that time, the first English teacher that they had ever had. We lived totally in the Turkish community. We were honorary Turks. And at that time, 57 or so, it was not EOKA policy to upset the Turks. So we were protected, in a way, for a large part of our time, by being, as I say, honorary Turks. The only Greeks we ever managed to talk to were people in government service, who were always pleasant and kind. But Cyprus was held on to by Britain, very largely for strategic purposes, I think.
Shelley House, your residence at the time, was given a new lease of life when Paphos served as European Capital of Culture in 2017. Do you have any memories that come flooding back while living in one of Paphos's most iconic and historic buildings?
Well, for a long time we were living in a hotel there where they tried to find a house for us, you know. There was no question at the beginning of our living in the Shelley house. It was too grand for us. We were pretty low in the colonial pecking order, let us say. Dr. Shelley had a good reputation in Cyprus. He died before we got there, but he distinguished himself in his efforts during the Paphos earthquake, you know. Stromby was the epicenter. But he had perhaps overdone things during his work in the earthquake, and he died of a heart attack. There was a Greek doctor and his wife who moved into the house, but they only lasted 1 month because the doctor's wife kept seeing Dr. Shelley. It was haunted. Some people laugh at this because, you know, they don't believe in ghosts. I believe in ghosts because as a child and as a teenager, I lived in a haunted house too, and I knew what it was like. So we went to live in the Shelley house, and it was a lovely house.
What were the influences and consequences of British colonial policies on education?
The colonial government was only fully in control of the Turkish side of education. It was in control of primary and secondary schools. But when it came to Greek schools, the colonial government was not in control of secondary education. The secondary schools on both sides were obviously channels for a great deal of political influence. The Turkish teachers from Turkey, they were obviously there to feed a certain amount of pro-Turkish sort of attitudes, you know.
What were your most memorable teaching moments?
One of the most striking, memorable moments in my life at the school was one day there was a big demonstration, a Turkish demonstration, probably Turks against Turks in this respect. I used to teach some of my kids in a little house, the other side the football field, detached. I got a lot of very young kids, well, 12-year-olds and so on, and they were doing their stuff, you know. And meanwhile, there was a big demonstration outside the main school, and they were getting very worked up. Turks, when they get worked up, are a pretty fearsome lot. I looked out of the window of my little flat. Coming towards me was a mob of Turks, just like that. A mob coming towards me and my little class. Actually, I wasn't frightened, because I knew that whoever they were against, it wasn't against me. But rather foolishly, I locked the door. They came in through the windows. They poured in through the windows. They picked up the students, these 12-year-olds, carried them out and went on. They just wanted more manpower or girl power, whatever, for their demo. It was one of my most memorable moments, yes.
How does John Turvey want to be remembered in the history books?
I would just like to feel that they remember it as a good bloke. I must have influenced some lives, as a teacher one does, in ways that one doesn't realise at the time. I'm always struck by the fact that people come up to me sometimes and say, yes, I remember you saying this. I've no recollection of saying this. It doesn't sound like me even, but it obviously had some effect on them. I hope good. But I do, I'm always very pleased to meet old students, you know, and they're always pleased to see me. One always has to struggle sometimes to be absolutely scrupulously fair. I sometimes feel that in some cases my attempts to be fair didn't always have good effects, you know. But I think one still has to be fair, you know, and there it is.